My parents advised me to go on a trip to Greece before my marriage. My aunt said, consider it a final fling with freedom. I went with joy, but when my fiancé texted, I never loved you, this is just easier, I collapsed. An hour later, I emptied our joint savings, sold his gaming PC, and sent flowers to his ex because I should have seen it coming. There were signs, not flashing neon ones, but subtle, quiet shifts that only become obvious when you look at them in hindsight. Nolan and I had been off for months before Greece, but I didn't want to admit it. We were engaged, wedding plans were underway, and I told myself the tension was normal. That everyone feels stressed before a big life change. But it was more than that. He had become withdrawn. Not in a depressed or dramatic way, just detached. We went from cooking dinner together to him eating microwaved leftovers while gaming in his office. Our conversations, once filled with teasing and long silences that felt warm, became transactional. Did you call the florist? Don't forget your cousin's RSVP. Are you picking up the dry cleaning? I brought it up once gently during a late-night walk around our neighborhood. It was early May, the trees just starting to burst green, the smell of cut grass in the air. I reached for his hand, and he didn't flinch away, but he also didn't squeeze back. I remember saying, do you feel like we're just going through the motions? He exhaled hard, like I'd handed him a backpack full of bricks. I think we're just busy, he said. There's a lot going on. And I clung to that answer. I swallowed it like medicine. After all, what bride doesn't feel a little uncertain before the wedding? I told myself I was being sensitive. That I always overanalyze. But things got weirder before I left for Greece. He barely seemed interested in the trip. No curiosity about where I was going or what I planned to do. He didn't help me pack. He didn't even ask for a picture once I landed. There was no FaceTime, no miss you messages, just the occasional thumbs up emoji when I sent him a photo of a ruin or a vineyard. And then came the texts. First, I never loved you. This is just easier. Then, an hour later, please don't come back. This isn't a mistake. It's clear. I was in Chania, Crete, when I read them alone, outside a linen shop, holding a bag of towels I'd bought for our future bathroom. My knees gave out. The world tilted. I must have looked ridiculous as a tourist sobbing on stone steps, clutching embroidered fabric like it could anchor me to a reality that had just exploded. I didn't tell my parents. Not right away. I couldn't bear to explain it, to relive it out loud. Instead, I went back to the villa, stared at the ceiling for 2 hours, then booked another week on the island. I wasn't going home yet. I had no home to return to. And oddly, that realization didn't crush me. It ignited me. The days after the breakup were strange. I alternated between grief and curiosity. Who was I without Nolan? What did I even want anymore? There was no one to answer to, no one to please. For the first time in a decade, my decisions were just mine. I deleted our shared wedding planning Google Sheet. I closed the Pinterest board. I archived our engagement photos. Then I remembered our joint savings account. I logged in. He hadn't touched it. $18,750, sitting there, meant for catering and chair rentals and overpriced floral arches. I stared at the number for a long time. Then I transferred every dollar into my personal account. A minute later, I logged into our shared Amazon Prime account and checked the order history. His gaming PC, the one he'd built like a sacred altar, all RGB lights and water cooling tubes, had recently been upgraded with a new graphics card. It was still in the delivery window. I canceled it. Then I listed the whole setup, the desk, the chair, and the dual curved monitors on eBay. Gone in 3 hours. I should have felt ashamed. But I didn't. I felt efficient. When I finally pulled up Instagram to block him, I saw something else. A picture. Nolan. Smiling. Holding hands with Marla, his ex. They were at a brewery. I recognized the background, it was our favorite Friday spot. Only now, it was theirs. The caption read, "Found my way back home." Home. Right. That's when the final piece of me snapped into place. I scrolled through Marla's page and it wasn't new. There were pictures from weeks ago. A dog that looked suspiciously like the rescue I'd begged Nolan to adopt last fall. A dinner plate that matched our kitchen set. It all made sense. She wasn't just the next girl. She was the reason. And oddly, that realization didn't make me cry. It made me smirk. The next day, I sent Marla flowers. A giant bouquet of white lilies and black tulips. I ordered them from a small Athens florist and paid extra for international delivery. The card? "Thank you for taking out the trash. You're doing God's work." Rhea, I imagined her opening the note, confused. Then reading it. Then maybe laughing. Or maybe not. Maybe it would get under her skin the way their betrayal had gotten under mine. I didn't really care. Because by that point, I was already planning the next thing, a celebration. The winery in Virginia we'd booked for the wedding wouldn't refund our deposit. But they would let me transfer the reservation. So I did. I turned it into a party. Not a breakup party, not a revenge bash. A liberation gathering. I invited my closest friends, my parents, Aunt Jo, who brought her wind sculpture boyfriend and a literal banner that read, "Freedom looks good on you." We ate, we drank, we danced barefoot under string lights. That night, as I watched my guests laugh and sway to a folk band's acoustic cover of Fleetwood Mac, I realized something. I hadn't just gotten out of a relationship. I had escaped a life that was never really mine. The celebration at the winery became more than just a party. It became a threshold. A crossing over. Friends brought gifts, not the kind you register for, but the kind that means something: hand-bound journals, rare teas, stones they'd found on hikes. My father gave a toast that made me cry in a good way. My mother hugged me with a kind of relief that said she'd been worried long before I'd admitted I was unhappy. It wasn't just about the end of Nolan. It was about the return of me. But freedom has its quiet moments too, not all healing happens at a party. After the dust settled, and the last guest drove off, I was alone in the small cottage I'd rented. The first week was odd. My phone didn't ring as much. There were no wedding appointments, no shared Google calendars filled with menu tastings or DJ meetings. The silence wasn't lonely, it was blank. Like a new canvas I hadn't dared touch yet. So I started painting literally. Not well, not with any real talent. But I bought a few cheap supplies and painted sunsets from Greece and abstract messes that made no sense. I planted basil on the windowsills. I took long walks without earbuds and started noticing the patterns in the bark of old trees. I stopped checking Instagram. And then came the ripple effects. The first was from Nolan's brother, Carter. He messaged me on a random Tuesday, "Hey, just wanted to say I'm really sorry for what happened. I don't know all the details, but you didn't deserve that." Carter and I had been cordial, nothing more. He was younger, a bit of a drifter, the kind of guy who never stayed in one city for more than a year. For him to reach out said a lot. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the message for a good 10 minutes. Then I typed, "Thank you. That means more than you know." A week later, Carter sent another message, this time with a screenshot of Nolan's Reddit post. It was in one of those vague relationships gone wrong subs, clearly written by him, under a burner account. He'd titled it, "Left my fiancé after realizing I was never in love. Now I'm with my ex, but everything feels hollow. Did I mess up?" There were paragraphs of him trying to justify what he did. How he thought he was doing the kind thing by being honest. How he believed Marla was what he really wanted. How now, 2 months later, they were already fighting. The dog had chewed through their new couch. Marla wanted commitment. He wanted space. He missed peace. That's how he described it. He missed peace. Not me. Not our life. Just the quiet I brought. That was a turning point. Not because I wanted him back, not for a second. But because I realized he never even saw me. He saw what I offered. The calm. The structure. The sanity. I wasn't a partner. I was his place to hide. And I didn't want to be anyone's refuge anymore. I wanted to be the storm. Or the sun. Or the entire damn sky. So I threw myself into things. Small things, like volunteering at the local library, mentoring a teen reading group. I helped Aunt Jo organize a charity art auction for one of her nonprofit causes. I reconnected with old friends I'd let drift during the Nolan years. We started meeting every Sunday for brunch, where we shared stories like old women in a salon, gossip, grief, joy, and everything in between. At one of those brunches, I told them the truth, not the polite version I'd been repeating. I told them about the text. The account transfer. The flowers to Marla. The party. Everything. They laughed. They gasped. One of them actually cheered. "That's not petty," said Marissa, a 42-year-old divorcee with the driest humor imaginable. "That's poetry." And maybe it was. Poetry written in vengeance and rewritten in growth. Still, I won't pretend it was all smooth sailing. There were nights I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made everything up in my head. If I'd missed red flags out of fear, or worse, desperation. There were days I questioned my judgment. Wondered if something in me was broken, something that always picked partners who loved the idea of me more than the real, messy human I am. One night, I opened an old journal where I'd written wedding vows. The draft I'd never shared. Reading them made me ache. Not for Nolan. But for the version of me who had wanted so badly to be chosen. Who had measured her worth in how tightly someone held her hand in public or if they asked about her day without prompting. That version of me wasn't stupid. She was hopeful. She deserved better. And I was going to give her that if it was the last thing I did. It was early November when I got the message that would test my resolve. I was in the middle of shelving returned books at the library, an oddly therapeutic task when my phone vibrated in my pocket. I ignored it at first. There's something calming about the smell of paper and dust, the quietness of people reading, and I didn't want to disturb it. But curiosity, that old devil, got the better of me. I pulled out my phone. Nolan Fairchild. I stared at the name for so long I forgot where I was. The first few words of the preview text were visible on the lock screen. "I don't expect you to reply, but I owe you." I left the cart half-sorted and walked out the back entrance, sat on the concrete steps behind the building, and opened the message. It was long. Surprisingly well written. No blame shifting. No self-pity. Just a string of confessions I never thought I'd hear from him. I didn't fall out of love with you. The truth is, I never understood what love actually was until it was too late. You were calm. You made life easy. I confused stability with boredom. I thought I wanted fireworks. I got them. And now I miss the ground beneath my feet. Marla and I didn't work. That's not the point, though. This isn't about wanting you back. I know that door is closed. I just wanted to say I see it now. How much you gave. How much I took for granted. The flowers made me laugh, by the way. Marla didn't find them funny, which probably says everything. I hope you're happy. I mean that. I read it twice. Then a third time. Then I locked my phone and placed it face down beside me. There were no tears. No tightness in my throat. Just stillness. I'd waited so long for him to say something like this. For closure. For acknowledgement. But now that it had come, I didn't need it. That in itself was closure. I didn't reply. Not because I was bitter. Not because I wanted him to feel ignored. But because there was nothing left to say. He had written a letter to his past. And I wasn't living there anymore. Over the next few weeks, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known since before the engagement. Maybe even before Nolan. Like my body finally understood it didn't have to brace for impact anymore. It was around that time I ran into someone unexpected, Alma. Alma was Nolan's mother. I spotted her at the downtown Saturday market, near a stall selling spiced honey and jams. She looked thinner, more worn than I remembered, but her eyes were just as sharp. We locked eyes across the table of apple butter jars. She walked over first. "Ria," she said with a little half-smile. "I wasn't sure you were still in town." I nodded. "Just quietly rebuilding." She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. "I won't keep you. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what he did. For how it happened." There was genuine regret in her voice, and also something more shameful, maybe. Or disappointment. "You don't need to apologize for him," I said gently. "I know," she replied. "But I should have seen what was happening. I should have warned you. But I thought maybe you were what would finally anchor him." There it was again. That word. Anchor. I said. But people don't always want to be anchored. Some want to float. Or run. She nodded slowly. "Well, if it's any comfort, you weren't the problem. He's still lost." We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We just stood there in the soft chatter of the market until someone bumped into us and we drifted apart. But that conversation stayed with me. Not because of Nolan. But because it reminded me how many people get pulled into the ripple effect of heartbreak. It's never just the couple. It's a family. Friends. The lives that intertwine and fray. The holidays came. My first solo Thanksgiving in over 7 years. I didn't dread it, though. I hosted a small dinner with Aunt Jo, a few library coworkers, and my friend Marissa, who brought a sweet potato pie so good it could end wars. We drank too much wine and played card games until someone accidentally knocked over a candle and we had to air out the living room for an hour. It was the best Thanksgiving I could remember. And just like that, I stopped counting how many months it had been since the breakup. I didn't need to. Life wasn't being measured in distance from pain anymore. It was being measured in presence. In laughter. In long walks and late-night conversations and the peace that came not from someone else's love but my own damn survival. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the dogwoods were blooming like soft pink lanterns all over Asheville. The wind felt different, not bitter, not biting, but curious. Like it was nudging everyone out of their winter caves, asking them to wake up. And I did. In so many ways. I'd settled into a rhythm that didn't revolve around anyone's moods or expectations but my own. I joined a ceramics class at the community center on Tuesdays, where I learned that I was objectively bad at making mugs but excellent at making oddly shaped bowls that somehow always found a home. I took up hiking again. Not the hard kind, the Sunday morning kind, with coffee in a thermos and long pauses to look at moss on rocks. I found a new appreciation for silence, not the empty kind I once feared, but the kind that hums gently around you like an old friend. It was during one of these hikes that I ran into Sadie. We hadn't seen each other since college roommates during sophomore year, the kind of friendship that flared intensely and then faded with time and distance. She had moved to Asheville a year ago, was recently divorced, and had picked up nature photography as a form of therapy. We grabbed coffee that same week, then made it a routine. She was the kind of woman who asked deep questions without making you feel interrogated. Over almond croissants and black tea, she once asked me, "What would you be doing if you'd never met Nolan?" The question floored me. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I hadn't let myself want anything for so long. My dreams had been tethered to what would fit within a shared future, the kind you plan around another person's preferences, moods, ambitions. "I used to want to teach abroad," I said slowly. Before we got engaged, I applied to a program in Italy for library outreach and literacy work. But Nolan said it would set back the wedding timeline. Sadie looked at me the way only someone who's survived similar battles can. Then maybe it's time to apply again. That night, I found the email thread from 4 years ago. The program still existed. Same director. Same city, Florence. They were accepting applications for the summer term. I filled it out on impulse, heart racing, palms slightly sweating. When I hit submit, it felt like lighting a match and not looking back. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not even my parents. I wanted it to be mine. Completely. No one else's business, no space for opinions or polite doubts. Just mine. A few weeks later, I got the response. Accepted. The email was short and warm and inviting. They remembered my earlier application. They were thrilled I'd applied again. They offered me a stipend, housing near the Duomo, and the opportunity to work with both children and local educators. I cried. Not because I was afraid. Because I was ready. Telling my parents was interesting. My mother, the planner, immediately asked about logistics. What would I do with my place? What about health insurance? What if I hated it? My dad beamed the way only a retired man who'd never traveled enough could. You're going to Italy, he said, pouring another cup of coffee. You're going to eat real lasagna and maybe fall in love with a sculptor. I'm going for work, I said. He just winked. Aunt Jo, when I told her, laughed for a full minute straight and said, I'll come visit and scandalize the nuns. In the weeks leading up to my departure, things started clicking into place. I sublet my cottage to a grad student named Marnie who collected crystals and played the harp. I sold some of my furniture, gave away the rest. I kept a few boxes with my parents and packed 2 suitcases, one full of clothes, the other full of books and art supplies. On my last day at the library, my coworkers threw a small send-off. They gave me a hardback copy of Under the Tuscan Sun and a card signed by everyone, even George, the grumpy part-timer who never smiled. Afterwards, I walked the stacks one last time, fingertips grazing the spines like they were old friends. I paused at the poetry section and pulled down a slim volume by Mary Oliver. It fell open to a line I'd underlined years ago. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I whispered it aloud, barely audible. Then I smiled. A few days before my flight, I ran into Carter again. Nolan's brother. At the farmer's market, of all places. He was picking out heirloom tomatoes. I was buying herbs. We made small talk at first about work, how the weather was, and how life was. Then he surprised me. Just so you know, he said, Nolan moved to Texas. Took a new job. Marla's gone. He's living with a guy named Clint who brews his own kombucha. Whole different world. I laughed. Sounds crunchy. Carter shrugged. I think he's still trying to find himself. But he said one thing that stuck with me. He said you were the last person who really knew him, and he ruined it. I didn't reply. Instead, I asked, do you think people can really change? Carter looked up at the sky, thought for a second. Yeah. But most don't. They just find better ways to disguise the parts they're not ready to fix. That sat with me. Even as I boarded the plane days later. Even as I watched the lights of North Carolina disappear beneath me. Even as the flight attendant spoke Italian and the cabin lights dimmed. I wasn't running anymore. I was choosing. And for the first time in years, the only person I needed to answer to was me. Florence greeted me with golden light and the smell of espresso drifting from every direction. The city was smaller than I expected, tight alleys, rust-colored rooftops, and corners that felt alive with whispers of history. It was beautiful, but not in the postcard-perfect way. It was chipped and faded and loud and real. I stayed in a small apartment just 5 blocks from the Duomo. The windows opened onto a street with motorbikes, church bells, and an elderly woman who swept the same square of sidewalk every morning at 7. My first few nights, I barely slept, not from jet lag, but from excitement that buzzed beneath my skin like an electrical current. The literacy program was everything I had hoped it would be. The work was rewarding and exhausting in the best way. I spent mornings helping teach Italian children how to read English through games and stories, and afternoons assisting librarians with cataloging in restored monasteries. The shelves smelled of parchment and lemon-scented wood polish. Sometimes, I'd get lost just running my fingers along the spines. And for once, there was no one asking when I'd be home. No one is waiting for dinner. No one to explain my day to in order to feel validated. It was just me. And it was enough. 2 months into my stay, I met Luca. It was a Tuesday. I was sitting at a quiet cafe near Piazza Santo Spirito, reading an old Penguin classic with a glass of red wine. I must have looked particularly immersed, because he said later that it was the way I turned pages like I was listening for secrets that caught his attention. He was an architect. Lived in Rome, but came to Florence twice a month to visit his aging aunt and consult on a restoration project. He asked if he could join me. I surprised myself by saying yes. We talked for 2 hours, not about romance or work or even the obvious tourist things. We talked about time. How it moves differently in old cities. How people chase happiness like it's something you have to hunt down and wrestle into submission. I think happiness is quieter than we think, he said. It doesn't yell. It sits in the corner, waiting for us to look up and notice. I don't know if it was the wine or the way the sunlight softened his face, but something about him put me at ease. There was no pressure. No agenda. Just warmth. He didn't ask for my number. I didn't offer it. But we bumped into each other again a week later, this time in line at the bakery I'd started frequenting for their olive oil cake. He was buying bread. I was buying croissants. We both smiled like we knew something was unfolding. That time, he did ask. We didn't date. Not in the way I'd known dating before. There were no labels. No "where is this going" conversations. It was simple. We met for coffee or long walks along the Arno. We shared meals and thoughts and sometimes silence. We kissed once under a street lamp after a rainy evening, and it felt like a promise, not of a future, but of presence. And strangely, it helped me heal in a way I hadn't expected. Because he never needed me to be anything. Not calmer. Not quieter. Not less ambitious. Not more romantic. I could just exist. And that was enough. It was late June when I received the email. Subject line, to Ria, from Marla. It was short. Careful. I wasn't sure if I should reach out, but something's been sitting with me since the day I got those flowers. I was angry at first. Thought you were mocking me. But now, I think I get it. You weren't angry. You were closing a chapter. Nolan and I didn't work. You probably guessed that. He was always somewhere else in his mind. You know what I mean. I left. Moved back to Michigan. Started over. And I wanted to say, thanks. Not sarcastically. Genuinely. Because after everything, you reminded me we don't have to stay in places where we are tolerated, instead of loved. I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't reply. But I smiled. Not the sharp, victorious smile of revenge. The quiet kind. The kind that seeps out when something clicks into place deep in your chest. Because in some strange, full-circle way, the woman who had once taken part in my betrayal had unknowingly handed me the last piece of closure. Not because she apologized. But because she confirmed what I already knew. I was never the problem. Summer in Florence was full and hot and heady. I extended my stay by another 3 months. Took on extra work helping digitize historical records in a 14th century archive. I walked more. Wrote more. I even started sketching again badly, but joyfully. Sometimes Luca joined me. Sometimes he didn't. That was the beauty of it. I was no longer living a life that needed to be mirrored back to me to feel real. I didn't need a witness to my choices. I was both the story and the storyteller now. And as the days grew longer and the sun began setting later across terracotta rooftops, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness. Something better. Wholeness. I returned to Asheville in early October. Not because something pushed me back, but because something inside me finally felt complete. Like I had absorbed everything Florence could offer me in that chapter of my life, and it was time to bring it home. The air back in North Carolina was crisp. The leaves had just started to change, golden and rust-colored confetti collecting on sidewalks. Everything felt smaller, but not in a bad way, more like how your childhood bedroom seems when you visit as an adult. Familiar, but different. I sublet a one-bedroom apartment close to downtown, with creaky floors and a tiny sunroom where I could drink tea and read in the mornings. My boxes were still safe at my parents' place. My dad had stacked them neatly in the garage and labeled them with a permanent marker, Ria's Life, Round 2. I laughed when I saw that. Because he wasn't wrong. My first few weeks back, I kept a low profile. Reconnected with friends. Volunteered at the library again, this time in a part-time capacity. It was nice to be around the books, the silence, the community. People were kind of curious about my travels, but never invasive. And for the first time, when people asked, "How have you been?" I didn't need to edit my answer. I told the truth. I told them I had unraveled, and then I had rewoven. Slower. Stronger. I didn't hear from Nolan again. His brother Carter sent me a picture of his new puppy once, just a casual, "Hey, meet Bongo," kind of text. That was the extent of it. And honestly, I was fine with that. I didn't need a reunion. Or an update. Or a scene. But the universe, in its strange sense of timing, had one final moment in store. It happened on a gray afternoon at the co-op grocery store. I was there picking up chickpeas and frozen spinach, in leggings, and an oversized sweatshirt, hair in a bun. I turned a corner and there he was, Nolan, standing by the bulk grains, scooping lentils into a paper bag. For a second, I froze. Not because I was scared or unprepared, but because I genuinely hadn't thought about what I'd do if we ever saw each other again. He noticed me. His eyes widened, then softened. "Ria," he said quietly, like saying my name out loud still felt heavy. I nodded. "Nolan." There was a pause. Not awkward, just full. "You look well," he said. "I am," I replied, meaning it. Another pause. "I heard you went to Italy." I smiled. "I did." "That's great." "Really?" "I'm glad." He seemed smaller somehow. Not physically, but spiritually. Like the weight of his choices had finally caught up with him. He didn't try to explain. Didn't ask how I'd been beyond polite. He just stood there, holding his bag of lentils, realizing that the woman in front of him was no longer tethered to the memory of who she used to be when they were together. "I'm happy for you," he said, finally. "Thanks," I replied. "I'm happy too." And then I walked away. Not out of cruelty. But because there was nothing else to say. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees were doing that slow dance they do in the fall, leaves swirling down in lazy spirals. I sat in my car for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me like a familiar coat. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt steady. Which, after everything, might be the greatest feeling of all. That night, I opened the Florence sketchbook I'd brought back with me. Flipped through pages of broken columns, fruit stands, cafe tables, and rooftops. On the last page, I'd scribbled a quote in the corner, something I'd overheard from a street performer near Ponte Vecchio. It said, "Sometimes, we think we're rebuilding, but really we're becoming someone we've never been brave enough to be." That felt true. Not just for who I had become, but for who I was still becoming. And so, I began again. Not with noise. Not with a bang. But with the quiet certainty that this life was mine. Fully. Freely. Finally.